She's tried to explain it to her friends and watched their faces go slightly skeptical. She's tried to explain it to herself and found the explanation keeps slipping past the words she reaches for. It isn't about security. Not really. It isn't about maturity in the simple sense people usually mean. It's something more specific than that, something she feels before she thinks it, something that happens in the quality of a conversation rather than its content. She feels around him like she doesn't have to manage the room. And if you've never felt the exhaustion of constantly managing a room, of monitoring the emotional temperature of the person across from you and adjusting your own behavior accordingly before they've even registered needing adjustment, that sentence might not land the way it should. But for a great many women, that management is so constant and so embedded in daily life that they've stopped noticing it as work. It has become simply how conversations feel, simply how relationships feel. A background hum of attention directed not inward at their own experience, but outward at the emotional state of someone else. Until suddenly, it isn't. And the quiet that follows is something she didn't know she'd been waiting for. Most people explain this dynamic in ways that are technically true, but psychologically shallow. Older men are more stable, they have more resources, they've had more experience in relationships, they've worked through some of the rougher edges of younger masculinity. These things matter, but they don't quite locate the real thing, the specific quality that produces the feeling she keeps returning to without fully being able to name. What most people don't realize is that the connection many women describe feeling with older men isn't primarily about what those men offer. It's about what those men have stopped needing from them. Stay with me here, because this distinction changes everything. Think about what it means to be around someone who needs very little from you in order to feel okay. Not someone who is cold or withholding, not someone who has closed himself off to vulnerability. Someone who simply arrived into the relationship already settled enough in himself that the relationship doesn't have to bear the weight of his sense of worth. Someone who doesn't need you to reflect him back a certain way in order to feel confident. Who doesn't need reassurance disguised as your agreement. Who doesn't need your attention to remain constant in order to feel secure. This kind of self-sufficiency is rare at any age, but it tends to concentrate in men who have lived long enough to have failed in ways that actually cost them something and discovered that they survived the failure, who have had their confidence challenged and found it rebuilt not through someone else's validation, but through their own quiet reckoning with what they actually value and who they actually are. This is where things become interesting. Imagine this. She's sitting across from someone who disagrees with something she just said. Most men she spent time with at the moment of disagreement either go slightly cold, or they pivot to winning the point, or they abandon their own position too quickly in a way that feels like performance rather than genuine flexibility. In every case, what she's actually watching is someone managing the discomfort of interpersonal friction by redirecting toward a resolution that makes the discomfort stop. The older man does something different. He sits with the disagreement. He thinks about what she said as though it's actually worth thinking about, not merely as an obstacle between him and being right. And then he responds from that genuine consideration rather than from the urgency to resolve the tension. His sense of himself doesn't depend on the disagreement turning out in his favor. He is, in some fundamental way, okay either way. She feels this. She can't always name it in the moment, but she feels it. And it produces something in her that most relationships haven't. The ability to think out loud in front of him without first calculating how the thought is going to land. We'll come back to what that freedom actually produces over time. But before we go there, consider where this capacity in older men actually comes from. Because the answer is not what most people assume. The deeper truth is this. The quality women respond to most deeply in older men is not wisdom in the abstract sense. It's not knowledge or experience or even emotional intelligence as a set of acquired skills. It is, more precisely, the particular peace that arrives when a man has stopped being at war with his own imperfection. Most younger men exist in a state of low-grade conflict with the version of themselves they haven't yet become. They are always slightly ahead of where they are, measuring the gap between who they are now and who they're trying to become, and experiencing that gap as a kind of deficit. This deficit creates a constant background pressure that shows up in how they receive criticism, how they respond to failure, how much of their partner's energy gets quietly redirected toward managing their emotional weather. An older man who has genuinely arrived at some kind of peace with his own incomplete, imperfect, error-prone self no longer radiates that pressure. He doesn't need her to see him as better than he is. He doesn't need the relationship to serve as evidence that he's figured everything out. He can be wrong, ordinary, uncertain, and still feel like himself. And the relief of being around someone who doesn't require constant inflation of their self-image creates a specific kind of relaxation she often can't locate anywhere else. Now we move deeper because there's a layer beneath this that most explanations of the dynamic never reach. Consider what happens psychologically when a woman spends years in relationships where she has to manage someone else's emotional state before she can attend to her own. Over time, she becomes extremely good at sensing what someone else needs before they know they need it. She develops an almost automatic attunement to the emotional atmosphere of any room she enters, particularly rooms containing people who matter to her. This attunement is genuinely valuable. It makes her perceptive, empathetic, skilled at navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. But it also costs her something she often doesn't notice until it's been missing long enough to feel its absence. It costs her the ability to simply feel her own feelings without first routing them through the question of how those feelings are going to affect the person across from her. This is where the connection to an emotionally self-contained older man starts to do something unexpected. When she no longer needs to monitor his emotional state constantly, the attunement she's been directing outward has nowhere to go but inward. She starts noticing what she actually thinks, rather than what she calculates is safe to think out loud. She starts noticing what she actually wants, rather than what she's decided is reasonable to want, given the emotional conditions in the room. She starts, almost without realizing it, to occupy more of herself, because he isn't occupying the space she normally surrenders in order to make things work. There is something deeper happening here, and it is one of the stranger and more beautiful paradoxes of this dynamic. She feels more like herself around him, not because he has done anything to help her find herself, not through conversation or insight or encouragement, but simply through the absence of the pressure that usually compresses her into a smaller version of herself. His self-containment doesn't push her in any direction. It simply removes the constant wind, and in the quiet that follows, she discovers she has been leaning against that wind for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply stand upright. What happens next is important, because this produces something in the relationship that she often describes as depth, without being quite sure where the depth is coming from. Most connections that feel deep are actually connections that feel effortful. Long conversations, intense vulnerability, shared struggle. These things can certainly produce closeness, and they matter. But there is a different kind of depth, quieter and in some ways more durable, that comes simply from being consistently, completely present with someone who allows you to be present with yourself at the same time. From conversations that don't require management, from silences that don't require filling, from disagreements that don't require softening before they can be spoken. This kind of depth doesn't feel intense. It feels like solid ground. And solid ground, after enough time spent on shifting terrain, is something a person doesn't easily walk away from. But before we go there, there's one final layer worth sitting with carefully, because it's the one that most explanations of this dynamic get almost entirely wrong. People tend to describe what women find in older men as a kind of filling of a lack. She needs stability, so his stability fills it. She needs emotional maturity, so his provides it. She needs someone who knows himself, so his self-knowledge meets the need. This framing, however sympathetic its intent, misses something important. It treats her as primarily a collection of needs waiting to be met, rather than a fully realized person discovering something new about how she functions at her best. The deepest truth is this: the connection many women feel with older men is not the connection of need-meeting supply. It is the connection of finally having room to be whole. Not because he completes her, but because he doesn't require her to be incomplete in order to accommodate him. This is a subtle but profound distinction. In relationships where she must constantly manage someone else's emotional state, she becomes, by necessity, partial. She gives her attention, her regulation, her careful calibration of when to speak and what to say and how to say it, to the maintenance of the relationship's emotional ecosystem. And in doing so, she has less of herself left over for the work of simply being herself. An older man who has resolved his own internal weather lets her be whole because he doesn't need her to be anything other than present. And presence, full, unmanaged, unperformed presence, is where the deepest connection actually lives. And this reframes the entire original question. Most people start with, why do some women feel more connected to older men? As though the answer lives in the qualities of the older man, in what he brings, what he offers, what he provides. But the better, more honest question is this. What would it mean to be the kind of person whose presence gives the people around you permission to be more fully themselves rather than less? Because that quality is not locked behind age. It is locked behind the willingness to do the internal work of becoming genuinely self-contained, genuinely settled, genuinely at peace with your own imperfection, until the people around you stop spending their energy managing your weather and start simply living in it with you. That is what she's responding to, not what he has, who he has finally decided to stop fighting against becoming. If this opens something for you, there is much more beneath the surface of how the quality of your own internal life shapes the quality of every connection you're capable of offering. Stay close. This understanding is only the beginning.